The atmosphere in the Ares training module, Askin Class 7's primary operations briefing room, was a meticulous study in controlled tension. The air conditioning hummed at a clinical 18 degrees Celsius, designed to keep the 25 astronaut candidates, Askins, at peak, focused alertness, counteracting the sweltering desert heat of the surrounding facility. The walls were smooth, seamless composite panels displaying a continuous, high-resolution feed of Earth from low Earth orbit, a perfect, swirling blue and white marble that mocked any thought of imperfection. The men and women sitting in the tiered, ergonomic chairs were the physical and intellectual elite, physicists, test pilots, and trauma surgeons, each one a pinnacle of human achievement, glowing with the clean, unblemished confidence of those who had never truly failed. Then, there was Dr. Gideon Holt. He stood before them like a geological anomaly. At 71, his skin, a rich, dark mahogany, was deeply scored by time and impossible pressures. He wore a jacket of faded charcoal tweed that swallowed his slim frame, and his hands, resting on the podium, were large, blunt, and covered in a network of fine intersecting scars. But it was his forearms, exposed by the loose sleeves of his shirt, that commanded and repelled attention. They were a violent, chaotic landscape of dark, permanent ink applied with no artistic grace. It was a messy, sprawling pattern that looked less like purposeful art and more like the desperate, crude lines of a prisoner marking time, used to mask a vast, underlying terrain of jagged, raised keloid scars. Gideon said nothing for a full, agonizing minute. He simply surveyed the room, his eyes, the color of slate, and just as unreadable, pausing on each Askin, his gaze a weight the recruits were unaccustomed to bearing. They were used to the quick, calculating assessment of an officer. Gideon's gaze felt like geological time, slow, ancient, and relentless. It was Instructor Lieutenant Commander Vega who finally cracked the silence. Vega, 32, a data analyst turned flight controller, was the epitome of a new generation military-industrial complex, precise, aesthetically flawless, and deeply convinced that all problems could be solved with the right algorithm. His uniform was crisp enough to shatter. "Sir," Vega began, his voice amplified by the room's internal mics, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. He didn't rise. He simply leaned forward, his elbows resting on his polished desktop, radiating contempt. "With respect to the importance of the operational endurance module, I must inquire. Are we conducting an assessment on survival in the void, or are we conducting an assessment on ancient graffiti and personal eccentricity? Because, sir, the ink is distracting the candidates." The casual cruelty of the question hung in the chilled air. A few nervous chuckles died instantly. Vega's implication was clear. "You are a relic. Your history is messy. My future is clean." He was speaking for the entire class, flexing the alpha dog confidence of the new elite who believed that old age equated to irrelevance. He expected a flinch, a hurried justification, or at least a defensive posture. Gideon didn't move. He continued to study Vega, his expression unchanging, a stillness that suggested the insult had been registered somewhere far beneath the surface, perhaps in the geological layers of his own personal history. "You find the ink distracting, Instructor?" Gideon finally asked. His voice was not soft, but entirely without inflection, a flat line of sound, like pressure equalizing in a sealed chamber. "Then I suggest you widen your focus. You are training for the void. The void cares nothing for protocol and less for aesthetics. It only accepts one currency, endurance." Vega, emboldened by the lack of direct aggression, pushed harder. "Endurance is calculated by biometric data, sir. We use real-time diagnostics. Your arms, with all due respect, look like a failure to prioritize scar revision. They look chaotic, like a scrapbook with no order. Is there a functional reason, or is this simply a preference for maximal scarring?" Gideon slowly pushed away from the podium. He took 2 deliberate steps, the slight, almost imperceptible hitch in his left side, a residue of an old, deep trauma he never concealed, visible now to the class. He walked directly toward Vega, the silence growing so heavy that the constant hum of the air conditioning sounded like a jet engine preparing for takeoff. He stopped directly over Vega, who suddenly found the old man's slate-colored eyes were not those of a derelict, but of something ancient and utterly predatory, eyes that had stared into true emptiness and returned. The arrogance on Vega's face wavered, replaced by a flicker of primal unease. "Chaotic," Gideon repeated, not as a correction, but as an agreement. He rolled his left sleeve up a little further, exposing the full sprawl of the darkest, thickest scar. "That's an excellent word for it, because what you study in books as a neat, linear progression is, in reality, chaos. And you asked why so many." He tapped the area with a calloused finger. "The answer is simpler than you think, instructor. Because I kept coming home." Gideon lifted his left arm, turning it slowly so the light caught the jagged, raised skin beneath the black sunburst pattern. The entire class leaned forward as one, instantly captivated by the sheer, undeniable reality of the damage. "You see this one?" Gideon asked, his voice now taking on a slow, deliberate cadence, like a scientist recounting a long-disproven theory. "It looks like a mistake, a crude sunburst, but it is a timeline. 2012, the Ares 5 mission. First attempt to establish permanent human presence near the Shackleton crater on the moon. We were laying the groundwork, literally, anchoring the primary habitation dome." He paused, and the entire room felt the chilling presence of the vacuum. The data was perfect. The telemetry was green. The risk probability of a critical strike was calculated at 0.0000001%. But probability is a mathematical construct. The void is not. The sound was not an explosion, but a whisper hiss, the sound of an impossibly small, fast micrometeoroid slicing through the pressurized hull of the primary life support umbilical. Gideon remembered the instantaneous feeling of the temperature dropping 30 degrees, the sudden, overwhelming stench of metallic ozone, and the violent, agonizing spike of the pressure gauge. The team scrambled, but the umbilical seal was compromised near the lunar regolith. They were hemorrhaging air into the vacuum. For minutes to catastrophic depressurization. The nearest spare patch kit was secured behind a primary power coupling, requiring a 15-minute shutdown protocol they didn't have. My swim buddy, a systems engineer named Kale, was closest to the breach, Gideon narrated, his eyes unfocused, looking past the recruits and into the terrifying, dusty darkness of the moon. He took a spray of super-chilled, escaping air and dust to his suit's torso. It wasn't a puncture. It was a hairline tear that was growing rapidly. We were trapped, pinned between a catastrophic failure and a hopeless protocol. Gideon threw off the protocol. He reached the damaged umbilical and, with seconds left, ripped the high-temperature thermal sealant off the secondary power coupling. It was a patch designed for temporary hull repair, not permanent pressurization, and it was scorching hot from operation. "I pressed it directly against the breech," Gideon explained, his voice low and detailed. "I held it. I didn't have the gloves for that heat. I didn't have the time to think. I just had the absolute certainty that if I let go, Kale died, and the entire habitat effort failed." He held that searing hot sealant in place for 47 minutes. 47 minutes, while the superheated polymer bonded to the titanium hull, while his own flesh seared beneath the contact point, while his mind fought the screaming agony that threatened to overwhelm his focus. His entire world narrowed to the single point of searing pressure on his palm and forearm. The thermal burn ran deep, searing the skin to the bone in jagged, radial patterns. The emergency rescue team arrived 12 minutes after the pressure stabilized. Kale lived. The habitat was salvaged. But when I removed my arm from the sealant, the flesh came with it. Gideon tapped the sunburst scar again. "This ink, I applied it myself, weeks later, with a crude needle and maintenance dye. It traces the path of that thermal burn. It reminds me of two things. First, that the plan is the first casualty of contact, and second, that protocol breaks when a life depends on human heat. You train for the grid. I train for the friction. That's the lunar seal." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't tension, it was shock. Vega's mouth was slightly open. He wasn't seeing a janitor's tattoo. He was seeing a map of a classified near-disaster, and the knowledge that the flawless Ares habitat they trained in was only standing because this man endured that scorching agony. Vega, scrambling to regain his professional footing, finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Sir, Dr. Holt, that is an extreme case of dedication. But the risk was known. You signed the waivers. That's the cost of exploration. He tried to frame the trauma as a necessary, accepted transaction. Gideon looked at him, and for the first time, a flicker of something like pity crossed his eyes. The cost of exploration, instructor, is acceptable. The cost of a lie is unforgivable. He raised his right arm now, exposing a much larger, darker area of ink, a swirling, abstract landscape covering scar tissue that felt less like a burn and more like a heavy, internal calcification. This one, the Great Divide, Gideon said. 1997, the Pioneer missions. We pushed past the Kuiper Belt, the first attempt to truly test long-term manned transit beyond the established solar terminus. Our objective was simple: collect data, test new propulsion methods, and most critically, validate the new generation of ceramic particle radiation shielding that the Institute had invested billions in. The mission was 3 months into the deep void. They were alone. The stars were cold pinpricks in the black. The ship was a silent tomb powered by faith and hyper-efficient plasma. Then came the anomaly, a sudden, massive, unpredicted spike in ambient cosmic radiation, a solar storm surge that the predictive models missed entirely. The alarm was silent at first, Gideon recalled, the memory painting his face with a terrible exhaustion. Just a low, chilling whine from the primary radiation monitors. The ceramic shielding, it didn't fail. It was structurally flawed. The conclave, the shadow board overseeing the project, had rushed the material, ignoring preliminary test warnings to meet a budget deadline. The shielding wasn't holding. The ship was being bathed in a soft, sickening, high-dose radiation bath. The realization was slow, insidious horror. The younger crew members, a team of 4, all under 30, were the future. Gideon, at 43, was the grizzled anchor, the one with the accrued career capital. The only way to save them was to channel the radiation away from the primary habitation module and into the maintenance conduit, a cramped, unshielded channel used for systems checks. I sealed myself in there, Gideon stated, the facts delivered with a chilling objectivity. I redirected the primary flow, turning the conduit into a human radiation sink. For 3 months, the time it took to initiate the slow, agonizing reversal trajectory, I lived in that metal pipe, watching the radiation counter climb, knowing every minute was subtracting a year from my life, knowing I was absorbing the cancer so they could come home clean. He didn't describe the pain as sharp. He described it as a slow, corrosive poison, a sickening fatigue that stole his vision, stole his appetite, stole his ability to think clearly. The loneliness was absolute. 3 months of silent, creeping decay, sacrificing his long-term health for the 4 young lives depending on his sealed, silent presence in that pipe. Gideon traced the Great Divide scar. This mark, it is the Institute's attempt to erase the truth of the failure. The flaw in the ceramic shielding was a multi-billion-dollar blunder. They told the public and the crew the shielding held, and that my internal distress was due to a pre-existing condition exacerbated by the stress of deep transit. They patched me up, gave me a minor commendation, and classified the failure as unforeseen environmental factors. They made the young crew heroes. They made me a silent casualty. I put the ink over the scar tissue, over the ridges created by the internal radiation damage to keep the receipt. It aches when the geomagnetic field shifts, and the pain reminds me not that I'm still here, but that the cost of human progress is often paid by those who are then forced to remain silent. You see a scar, instructor. I see the Institute's lie written on my body. Vega, now sweating despite the cool air, was utterly silenced. This wasn't a hero. This was a martyr who had been systematically gaslit and erased by the very institution he saved. He realized with dawning horror that the Ares, 5 Habitat, and the Kuiper Belt mission were the foundational pillars of the current Askin curriculum, pillars built on the lies Gideon carried. Gideon stepped back, his voice now dropping to a level that demanded absolute attention. He was no longer addressing Vega, he was addressing the conscience of the room. And then, there is the final scar, he whispered, his hand going to his chest, just above the collarbone, where a dense, swirling, violently black pattern of ink concealed the most profound wound. This is the one that broke me. And this is the one the Institute swore never existed. The tension became unbearable. This was the core, the ultimate cliffhanger. 2008, the Odyssey incident. Not the void of space, but the void of the deep ocean, the Challenger Trench. We built the first manned research vessel to attempt a full-depth traverse, the deepest point on Earth. It was an engineering marvel designed to withstand impossible pressure. The descent was flawless, silent, and terrifying. They reached the crushing, absolute blackness of the bottom. But the failure didn't come from the overwhelming pressure which the hull was designed to resist. It came from an internal, structural flaw. A small, improperly welded seam in a non-critical ballast tank, another corner cut by the conclave to meet a political timeline. We weren't crushed. We imploded slowly, internally, Gideon narrated, his hand clenching over his chest. The hull breach wasn't external, it was a propagating, internal rupture of the pressure equalization system. The sound was the worst. Not a bang, but a slow, continuous wail of tearing metal, a sound that told you the laws of physics were unraveling around you. The 4-person crew, all brilliant scientists, descended into absolute panic. They were sealed, trapped, and the pressure was building internally, threatening to invert the sub. The communications were dead. They knew no one was coming. They were 18,000 feet deep, buried beneath the weight of the Pacific. I had to open the inner hatch, seal myself in the damaged section, and use a manual pressure wrench, a tool no human should ever have to manipulate under that stress to keep the collapse from spreading. I kept the sub stable for 53 hours. The crew, they had surrendered. They were waiting for death. I was fighting for life. The physical toll was apocalyptic. The pressure change ruptured an artery. The force of the manual wrench tore muscle, and the claustrophobia in that failing chamber was an existential terror. But Gideon held the line. The sub was finally found by a remote drone, and the crew was saved. Gideon looked directly at the Askins. When the Institute retrieved the vessel, they found the crew alive, traumatized but safe. They found the structural flaw, and they found me, barely alive, sealed in the damaged section. The truth would have invalidated 10 years of deep-sea research and exposed the conclave's negligence. So, they made a decision. They pronounced me a hero lost in the incident. They gave me a marble statue on the main quad, the ultimate gesture of respect, but they scrubbed my survival from the operational log. They declared me dead, a beautiful, necessary sacrifice. They buried me alive. He tapped the dense ink on his chest. This scar, this chaotic ink, traces the path of the ruptured artery, the deep tissue trauma. It's the receipt for the life I saved. But more importantly, it is the absolute proof that I am still here. I endured the void of the trench, and then I endured the profound void of being systematically erased by the people I saved. The ink covers the space where my life was deleted from the historical record. I have so many scars because I am the only surviving witness to the truth. The room was silent, utterly broken by the weight of the story. Vega, tears tracking paths through the sweat on his face, looked like a man who had watched his entire life's philosophy crumble into dust. The young Askins were shell-shocked, realizing that the heroes they studied were built on the lies of this one man suffering. Gideon rolled down his sleeves, covering the history, covering the scars, becoming just an old man in a charcoal jacket again. "You want to know the final reason for the ink?" he asked, his voice returning to that soft, gravelly whisper. "It's to ensure that when I look in the mirror, I don't see the perfect hero they sculpted in marble. I see the tired man who endured. You boys are blank canvases. You're perfect. My job is to teach you how to stay that way for as long as possible. But make no mistake, if you do this job right, if you do it long enough, you will get marked." Just as he finished, the heavy steel door at the back of the room hissed open. Director Anya Sharma, the head of the Global Aerospace Consortium, walked in, flanked by her security team. The candidates, despite their shock, instinctively jumped to their feet. "Attention on deck." Director Sharma raised a hand, her sharp, formidable gaze locked not on the recruits, but on Gideon. The command structure in the room instantly evaporated. "As you were, gentlemen. Please be seated." She walked slowly to the front, ignoring the podium, stopping directly next to Gideon. Her face broke into an expression of profound, almost painful reverence, bordering on shame. "Gideon," she said, her voice heavy with unspoken history, "I was delayed in transit, but I see you have already begun the history lesson." She turned to the class, her eyes scanning their stunned faces, resting for a moment on the completely broken Instructor Vega. Gentlemen, you have just heard the oral history of 3 classified incidents. What you must understand is that Dr. Gideon Holt is the single most valuable human asset in this entire consortium. He is the author of your survival manual. He is the reason your current home material has been upgraded 3 times, and he is the reason we have the Ares 5 habitat plans today. She paused, her voice rising to a devastating public declaration. The man you see before you, the man the Institute publicly memorialized as a dead hero, was Dr. Alaric Vance's primary research partner on all foundational missions. When the conclave silenced his findings to cover up flaws, they also erased Gideon. The scars on his body are not just injuries. They are the Holt cipher, the living evidence of structural defects that cost lives. The true data lives on his skin, not in our archives. She stepped toward Gideon, and in a gesture that stunned the entire room, she lifted his hand, the hand that had endured the heat of the lunar seal, and brought it to her lips. She pressed a deep, formal, apologetic kiss to the back of his hand, a public penance for the sins of the institution she now ran. Dr. Holt, Director Sharma said, her voice thick with emotion, we didn't just need you here to teach them how to endure. We needed you here to ensure the truth could never be erased again. The debt is long overdue. Vega, seeing the kiss, the absolute reverence of the director, and realizing the depth of his professional, ethical, and personal failure, stood up, trembling. Director Sharma, he stammered, his voice choked with shame. I insulted a legend. I offered my resignation immediately. Director Sharma looked at Vega, her expression cold and decisive. No, instructor. You will not resign. Resignation is too easy. You failed to look beyond the surface, but you show the capacity to feel shame, which is the beginning of wisdom. She pointed to Gideon. Effective immediately, Dr. Holt's full rank, clearance, and salary are reinstated to the level of senior field consultant. He is no longer a guest. And Instructor Vega, your new assignment is to serve as Dr. Holt's personal security and administrative liaison. You will document, digitize, and preserve every single story, every scar, and every lesson Dr. Holt is willing to share. Your task is to correct the historical record you tried to dismiss. Vega, humble to the core, snapped to attention. Understood, Director. Thank you, sir. Gideon simply nodded, accepting the new reality with the same quiet endurance he had accepted the vacuum and the trench. The lecture finally ended. The Askins did not move immediately. They sat for a long time, the weight of the new knowledge crushing their former arrogance. When they finally filed out, they stopped, not to shake his hand, but simply to pass by, their heads bowed in silent reverence, their eyes now fixed not on the perfection of the walls, but on the raw, ugly truth of the man who had paid the cost. Later that evening, in Director Sharma's private office, the final elements of justice were enacted. Gideon, Sharma said, looking at him with immense relief, the Institute's assets will be used to establish the Holt Foundation for Unseen Pioneers. Its sole mission will be to provide full, non-repayable grants to the auxiliary staff, the maintenance crews, the janitorial staff, the unsung technical assistants, who are always the first to witness failure, but the last to receive credit. It will be run by you. Gideon sat quietly, looking at the city lights twinkling in the distance. You're giving me my life back, Anya, and a purpose I didn't know I needed. You never lost your life, Gideon. We just stopped looking at it. But now we will look. 6 months later, Dr. Gideon Holt no longer wore the charcoal jacket. He wore a simple, well-tailored suit that fit his frame. He worked from a dedicated archival suite in the Ares Tower, overlooking the very quad where his memorial statue had stood. Instructor Vega was now his fiercely loyal aide, impeccably efficient, humbled, and endlessly learning. Vega no longer saw data. He saw the human element that data always missed. One afternoon, Gideon stood by the window, looking out over the facility. Vega was carefully cataloging a newly revealed scar on Gideon's upper arm, a small, faded spiral that Gideon called the rendezvous mark. Master Chief, Vega asked softly, a title of respect he had instinctively adopted. Why this one? It looks so small, almost trivial compared to the others. Gideon smiled faintly, a slow, gentle expression that softened the ancient lines of his face. He touched the faded spiral. That mark, Vega, is the last one I got. I carved it myself, right before the rescue ship docked after the Odyssey disaster. I wasn't marking a failure or a survival. He looked out at the sky, at the vast, impossible blackness he had mastered and endured. I carved it to remind myself that after all the heat, the radiation, the pressure, the loneliness, and the lies, after all of it, I still had the strength left to remember who I was and that I was coming home. The scars are for the world, son. The ink is for me. The only easy day was yesterday. But today, Dr. Gideon Holt was finally, truly and publicly home. The man they tried to erase was now the foundation.